Welcome to the Daily Thinker podcast, you guys. I am so excited for this episode, man. I'm so excited to just have a scholar on to talk about a topic that I love, to talk about the Old Testament, which I love. At a point, you know what? I wasn't sure about the Old Testament when I was reading through it, like, oh, these laws, this and that. This has nothing to do with me at all. But anyway, guys, if this is your first time here at the Daily Thinker, man, this podcast consists of faith, sports, theology, apologetics, all in one show. Nobody else, I repeat, nobody else on this face of this earth is doing what we're doing here at the Daily Thinker. Nobody. If they are, let me know so we can team up and maybe collaborate. We can do something great. But anyway, I just want to present to you Dr. Imes. Dr. Imes, how are you doing on today?
I'm doing awesome. It's great to be with you.
You can hear the cheering in the background. We are excited here at the Daily Thinker to have Dr. Imes.
Sounds like you have more people in that room than are currently allowed under COVID restrictions.
Well, you know, that's fine. When you have somebody like you come on, we got to pack the thing out. We got to pack the studio out. Break the rules. I'm sorry. The government might find out, but who cares? We got Dr. Imes on. That's all we care about today. So, man, we're going to talk about the Old Testament today. We're going to talk about the law. We're going to talk about a lot of things. And first, we're going to talk about this commandment that a lot of people use the wrong way, taking the Lord's name in vain. And I was someone who looked at people and they say, OMG, or, you know, just say some crazy thing. Like, what are you doing? Can you just shut up? It made me cringe a little bit. But after getting introduced to this book right here, this book, if you don't have this book, you're wasting your time. I don't know what you're doing. You haven't read a book yet then. You need to go get this book, and don't make no excuse because you say, oh, I don't read paperback. The Audible is available, okay? And I think on audible.com, if it's your first time buying an audio book, you get your first book free. So, hey, this is not a sponsor ad anyway, because if they were sponsoring me, I'd be happy, but they're not. But make sure you go get this book, Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters. Man, this is an awesome book because I was someone who thought Sinai was done away with. I'm not going to throw the book now because this is a special book to me. I'm going to have to get a case or something, but I'm not going to throw that book. We don't need to throw the Old Testament away. What am I talking for? Dr. Imes, can you just give us your background and how you got into this type of studies? Just let us know.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm professor of Old Testament at Prairie College in Three Hills, Alberta, which is in Canada, north of Montana, for those of you down in the States. I've been teaching here for 3 years. This is the beginning of my fourth year here, and I get to teach all of our Old Testament classes, which is so much fun. And I got into teaching Old Testament because I could see that so many Christians wanted to love their whole Bible, wanted to read and understand the whole Bible, but they got really stuck when it came to the Old Testament and they didn't know what to do with it. So my endeavor was to study as much as I could, learn as much as I could, and then pass that along to the church. And that's what I'm doing now. It's the best job in the world.
Try to just do away with the Old Testament, especially people my age, okay? You go to the Old Testament, they're like, oh, what is this? Makes them cringe. We look at the law like it's just this burden, and we're going to get into that a little bit. I'm ready to talk about that. I am definitely ready to talk about that. But I want to know, what made you want to write this book, Bearing God's Name? What's the importance of this book?
Yeah, so I did my doctoral dissertation on the command not to take the Lord's name in vain. So I studied it in depth for 5 years. And I wrote my dissertation. I published it. It's called Bearing Yahweh's Name at Sinai, a reexamination of the name command of the Decalogue. As you can tell, that's a mouthful. And I knew that most people were not going to read that book because it's really technical. There's Greek and Hebrew and other languages in it. But all the way through, as I was studying that command, I kept thinking, the church has got to hear this. This stuff is paradigm shifting. It's mind blowing. It's so important. And so then I got this opportunity from InterVarsity Press to rewrite the book, represent what I learned in a form that anybody could read. So I was pretty rigorous as I was writing to not use words that my own daughter wouldn't understand. She was 17 when I was writing it. My oldest was 17. And so she read the entire manuscript, and we took out all the words she didn't know. And we clarified all the things that she thought were confusing so that it would speak to young people, as well as adults. I know of a woman in her 90s who read the book and loved it. And so I've had people all across the spectrum read it. And I'm so pleased to see the church grabbing hold of this concept. In a nutshell, the command, we usually think of that command as God telling the Israelites that they shouldn't say his name either in a certain way or in a certain context. Most of us probably grew up thinking that it was like telling us not to swear, not to use bad language, like use God's name as bad language. I don't think that's what the command is about. I think that God is telling the Israelites not to misrepresent him in anything they do, that the command is actually talking about that at Sinai, he put his name on them. It's like he tattooed them with his name or branded them, saying, you are mine, you belong to me. And so the command is saying, because you belong to me, you represent me to other people, don't misrepresent me. So it's way bigger than how we say the name of God or when we say it.
Wow, that's amazing. You said something that was so important to me. You belong to me. Mm-hmm. So this example came to my head. And you can tell me if this is a good example or not, or you can just talk about it a little bit more. That's like when you get married, like you're married, so you bear the name Imes. So
I do.
You belong to your husband. So you have to represent your husband whenever you go out. Is that the same way we need to represent and bear God's name?
It's probably the closest example or analogy that we have in our culture today, because we don't tend to go around wearing names, although we wear name brand and we wear team jerseys. So you said you like to talk about sports. If you think about the players on a basketball team wearing their team jersey, if they win a game and then they go out and trash the other team, if they're out putting graffiti on the other team's gymnasium or stadium, if they're beating people up in the alley, that's not just a reflection on them, it's a reflection on their team because they belong to that team. So either taking someone's name in marriage or wearing a team jersey are probably the closest we get to this idea of bearing God's name, but both of them are not quite full and rich enough to capture this idea, because God is saying to his people, you are my people, which means I am your God and I'm going to protect you. I'm going to bless you. I have plans to use you in ways that will be life-giving and help you flourish. And so it's a huge concept. And that's why my title is Why Sinai Still Matters. I truly believe that as Christians, we can't fully know who we are or what we are supposed to do with our lives unless we go back to Sinai and get this right.
We don't know what we do with our lives unless we go back to Sinai and get this right. Wow. Mm-hmm. And you use some great words when you talked about the God of the Old Testament, which I think is the same God of the New Testament. But it seems like sometimes we separate it. You said loving, caring. You belong to me. Every time we talk about the God of the Old Testament, when people bring up the God of the Old Testament, they say, oh, vicious. He loves murder. He loves blood and all of these things. Why do we think like that in the 21st century?
It's true that the God of the Old Testament is strict. It's true that there is wrath and there is sometimes blood, but it's because Israel belongs to God that he so fiercely protects her and so fiercely demands that Israel walk in a way that's worthy of her calling. And so, if I take my husband's name in marriage, you used the marriage example, so we can use that again. If I take my husband's name, we got married 22 years ago, I became Carmen Imes. Let's say the next week I go out and start sleeping around. That is going to arouse my husband's jealousy, and he's going to be deeply hurt by my unfaithfulness. And so he's gonna react emotionally and maybe even I'll maybe even see some wrath expressed or some deep regret and remorse, right? Because there's been a breaking of the covenant that we made between us. That's why we see God get angry in the Old Testament, because he has made a covenant with his people. They've been like betrothed in marriage, and then his people are unfaithful to him. They go around worshiping other gods. They go around misrepresenting him to the nations. And so he is deeply grieved and he has to do something about it. But that same God is in the New Testament still deeply grieved over our sin. It's not a different God. So one of the things that I try to do in my book is take people back to the Old Testament and show them how lavish God's grace is at Sinai. That when we see his wrath in the context of his great grace, it just helps put everything in perspective. God is not just throwing around rules for people to do just because he feels like messing with their lives. He is trying to invite them into a new way of living, a way that will be life-giving, that will allow them and their neighbors to flourish. And so when they cross the boundaries and begin to mess things up, that's when we see the what we would call the negative emotion of God, or the negative responses. But it's all done out of love.
Yes, it is always done out of love. And that brings you we talking about Sinai right now. And when you just bringing up, it just makes me think about the law and the covenants. So we have all of these covenants. And so we think sometimes, well, I know I got the impression like at first, okay, all these covenants are different. They can't fit together. Like the covenant with Noah, covenant with Abraham, the covenant with, David. Now you have the covenant at Sinai. You have the giving of the law. You have the new covenant with us. I want to know, how do all of these covenants come together as one?
It's a good question. One of the things that I talk about in the book is that I don't see the new covenant as a dramatic break from the old covenant, but rather a renewal of it. God is not scrapping the old one and starting something new. He's renewing or refreshing the covenant in the same way that we read in Lamentations that his mercies are new every morning. I think the covenant is new in the same way. It's not radically different from yesterday's mercies. It's the same mercy. This is the same covenant, but it's been renewed and refreshed in Jesus. So scholars have answered that question in different ways. There are different views out there about whether these covenants connect or whether they're separate. So I would connect the covenant with Abraham to the covenant at Sinai and the new covenant in the New Testament. The covenant with David is a little different because it involves his family line, his dynasty as king. And the covenant with Noah is also different because it involves all of creation, not just the chosen people. But I would definitely connect Abraham and Moses and Sinai and then Jesus. So one of the things that is striking to me is that when God reveals himself to Moses at Sinai, this is before he brings the people out of Egypt. Moses has been on the run from Pharaoh. He becomes a shepherd in Midian. He brings his flock. They end up at Mount Sinai there. It's called Horeb. It's another name for the same area. And he reveals himself to Moses, and he says in Exodus 3, verse 6, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So the thing that happens at Sinai with Moses is explicitly connected to God's relationship with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So if we go back to Genesis to see his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we see that they involve a promise of land of their own, of many offspring, and of blessing, not just blessing for themselves, but blessing for all nations through them. And so when God says to Moses, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then proceeds to make a covenant or renew that same covenant with the people of Israel as they come out of Egypt, I think it's the same promises we're seeing come into effect, that he is bringing them to a land of their own. He's going to multiply them, which he's already begun to do. There's so many Israelites at that point. And he wants to bless all nations through them. So when he says not to bear his name in vain, as part of the 10 Commandments, it's because they are his designated representatives. They're supposed to bring blessing to the nations, and they can't do that if they're living in ways that are dishonoring to him.
That makes me want to bring up this question, because you talked about God revealing himself to Moses at Mount Sinai. Like, what was the importance of that? Because I looked at that, I'm like, okay, God revealed himself to Moses, and so what? Just keep moving on. Like, what is the importance of that?
Well, if you're Moses, it's super important, because Moses is such an interesting figure. He's born a Hebrew, but then he's adopted by the daughter of Pharaoh and raised in the palace. So all the way through the opening chapters of Exodus, his identity is in question. Is he a Hebrew? Is he an Egyptian? Then he moves to Midian and becomes part of this Midianite family. And there's this sort of question mark over his head all the time, like, where does he belong? So when God appears to him at Sinai and says, I am the God of your father, I imagine there's a pause right there. And I imagine Moses is like, which one? Like, which father? Are we talking about Amram, the Levite, part of the nation of Israel? Are we talking about Pharaoh or the husband that whoever the daughter of Pharaoh is married to? We never hear about him. Or are we talking about his father-in-law that he's just come under his roof? Moses' own identity is in question. So it's a really big deal that God says, I'm the God of your father. Then he clarifies, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So immediately Moses is being told, you belong to the people of Israel. Even though you didn't grow up with them, you've been sort of alienated from them and you're not living with them now. Those are your people and I'm your God. So it's a big deal for Moses, but it's also a big deal because the stuff that happens to Moses in the early chapters of Exodus happens to the entire nation immediately following that. So you have this pattern. It's a really cool pattern.
Wow, I never thought of that. Like,
where Moses is at risk of Pharaoh murdering him. And so he escapes through the reeds, like he's put in a basket in the reeds, right? And then he eventually he's under threat again and leaves Egypt, crosses the wilderness, and goes to Sinai and meets Yahweh. Yahweh says, this is my name. This is what you're to call me. And he commissions Moses to go do his work. Then we immediately switch to scene 2, where the people of Israel are under threat. Pharaoh is trying to kill them. They escape through, we call it, in our English Bibles call it the Red Sea, but it's in Hebrew, it's actually the Sea of Reeds. So just as Moses was hidden in the reeds in the water, now the people are as a whole escaping through the Sea of Reeds. They go through the wilderness, they show up at Sinai, and Yahweh again reveals himself to them. And in chapter 19 of Exodus, when they get to Sinai, he calls them his treasured possession, which implies that they've been given a job to do to represent him to the nations. So just like Moses was commissioned at Sinai, now the people are being commissioned at Sinai. It's so cool.
Man, that is cool. How did I miss all that? I don't know how many times I read that story, read that account. I never connected those dots at all.
Yeah, it's fun stuff. So I'm working on a commentary. I'm writing a Bible commentary on Exodus right now. And so I'm getting to linger with these chapters, and I'm seeing so much I never saw before. And I'm releasing videos. Your listeners might be interested. I'm releasing a video every Tuesday called Torah Tuesday, and they're like 5 minutes long. And I'm just giving little nutshell insights that I'm seeing, like things like the Moses hiding in the reeds versus the people crossing the Sea of Reeds. The stuff that I'm learning, I'm trying to pass along right away in these videos. So anybody can watch those.
Please do, because you just passed on some important knowledge to me that I didn't know at all. I mean, you wouldn't know how many times I read and listened to that account and never Never crossed my mind at all.
There's so much there.
But I know in your book, you also talk about the importance of God revealing his name to Moses, that, other gods in that time frame, they didn't reveal their name to God. So can you dive in a little deep into that?
Yeah, in Egypt, there's a text called the Legend of Isis and Re, which deals with this subject. In Egyptian thought, if you want to have access to a god and access to their power, you need to know their name. But they go around using pseudonyms, like nicknames that aren't their real name. And so it's like a really big deal. If you can figure out, if you can trick a god into saying their name, then you have some sort of access to them that you didn't have before. So when Yahweh shows up when God shows up at Sinai and says to Moses says, "What's your name?" And God answers the question. It's a really big deal because God is saying, all right, you can call me Yahweh. Like, we're going to be on a first name basis. You have access to me that you didn't have before. So it's a big deal for Moses because he's been being given access, and God is taking a big risk in giving people access to him via his name because they could misuse it. And of course they do. People do all the time. But it's also a big deal because I lost my train of thought. It's also a big deal because it verifies his identity. So Moses lives in a world, he grew up in Egypt where there were lots of gods who were worshipped. And yet, so he has this voice speaking to him at Sinai, like saying, Moses, take off your sandals for you're on holy ground. Like there's all this stuff going on, and why would he know who's talking to him? There's lots of gods, right? And so he wants to verify who's speaking to him. And when Yahweh identifies himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it's connecting in with the story of his action on behalf of Moses' family line going back for generations. So it's a big deal because it connects us with the Genesis story. It gives us access to God by his personal name. I'll never forget the day when I studied at Wheaton College doing my doctorate. I had the opportunity to have some classes with Dr. John Walton, who's really well known for his work on the Old Testament. I'll never forget the day I was walking down the hall and I said, "Hi, Dr. Walton." And he stopped me and he said, "Carmen, it's about time you started calling me John." And I was like, whoa, I get to call you John? Like, does that make me a big kid now? Like, am I at the grown-up table? And it just felt like a really big deal because he was treating me as a colleague rather than as, a lowly student. And I think Moses is having that sort of encounter with God at Sinai, only on a way bigger level. The God of the universe is saying, hey, call me Yahweh. Let's be friends.
Wow. So is it fair to say that no other religion has that type of God that reveals his name to his people? That's kind of special.
Yeah, it is very special. I'm thinking of Islam. Muslims call God Allah, but Allah is not a name. It's a title. It's a word that means God. Just like God is not a name, it's a title. Professor is not my name. It's what I do. It's the role that I play. So God describes the role of this being, but it's not a personal name. So I think you may be right that biblical faith is unique in revealing the name of God.
This has me excited.
It is exciting.
It's real exciting to know that no other religion can really say that their God revealed their name to them. And part of the reason we miss this as we read our English Bibles is because if you open the Old Testament, it doesn't say Yahweh. Every time the name Yahweh appears in the Old Testament in the Hebrew Bible, our English Bibles render it with the word Lord in all capital letters. So if you've ever noticed that in your Old Testament, if it says Lord and it's all caps instead of just a capital L, that means that's the name Yahweh in Hebrew. That's their code for telling you that. But so many Christians have read the Bible a lot or listened to it and have no idea that that's God's personal name right there. Man, that's good. That's good to hear it. Like a lot of times up in the African American community, we use the name Jesus, and now it gets a lot of backlash. Or we use God, or even sometimes Yahweh. We use Yahweh, and some people say, "Oh, that's not the right name. Like the J wasn't in the Hebrew and all that." So how can we address stuff like that? Because I know that Peter talks about like there's no name under heaven by which we must be saved, but the name Christ, Jesus, Jesus. So people say his name wasn't Jesus, so y'all following a false God. Like how can we just combat that foolishness?
There is a lot of controversy around saying God's name. So first you mentioned the J. So in church history, there was a period of time in which Jehovah was the preferred way to refer to God by name. And that comes from a long tradition, but the maybe quick way to explain it is that Jews for a long time did not want to mispronounce God's name or use it inappropriately. So in the Hebrew Bible, when the name Yahweh appeared, so the Hebrew Bible is written just in consonants first, and then hundreds of years later, somebody came along and put the vowels in. So for the name Yahweh, they wanted to make sure people didn't say it by accident. So instead of putting in the vowels for Yahweh, they put in the vowels for Adonai, which means Lord. So that would remind people when they came to that word in Hebrew to say Lord instead of Yahweh, to say Adonai instead of Yahweh. And then somebody came along maybe in the 1800s and was learning Hebrew and trying to read it. And they came to that word and they didn't know it was a nonsense word. They didn't know they weren't supposed to say those vowels with those consonants. So they sounded it out and it was Yahovah, which put through the German language became a J. So Jehovah. So Jehovah is the name. Lots of people, there's hymns with the name Jehovah in it, but it's actually a nonsense word. We can be 100% sure that's not how it was pronounced in ancient Israel. So people were trying, they just didn't know Hebrew well enough to know what was going on with that. So there are still people who say we shouldn't say God's name at all, or the way we should say it is not Yahweh because there's other possible ways to pronounce it. We can't be 100% sure of how it was actually pronounced since they were so careful for so many years not to say it and not to write it with those vowels. But scholars are in pretty widespread agreement that Yahweh is a decent way to pronounce it. Some think it's Yahoo or Yahweh, but I go with Yahweh because it's the most commonly accepted by scholars. And you're right. When Peter is preaching in the book of Acts, he quotes the book of Joel. There is no other name by which we must be saved. And in Joel, that's referring to Yahweh. But he applies that to Jesus, which is a mind-blowing moment because he is essentially calling Jesus God and including Jesus within the divine identity. So he's just conflating the two. He doesn't see a difference between Yahweh and Jesus. So I think it's fine to call God, to pray to Jesus, to use, to call out to Jesus, to worship Jesus. I use the name all the time. Some people would say we should say Yeshua rather than Jesus because Yeshua would be the Aramaic way of pronouncing it. But our New Testament didn't come to us in Aramaic. It came down to us in Greek. So the name comes into English as Jesus. I'm not a big stickler on how you decide to pronounce it. Yeah. I think the big deal is that we're invited to have this personal relationship with God and to represent him. Right.
But you just gave me another way to defend the deity of Christ. So I love that.
It's amazing stuff.
And so I want to talk about what's the difference between blaspheming God's name and bearing God's name. Because we see that a man was stoned to death because he blasphemed the name of God. And so what is the difference between those two, bearing and just blasphemy?
Great question. So you're referring to Leviticus 24, where there's a man who blasphemes the name. It seems, I've read the Hebrew really closely. I've thought about that passage. It seems like what's happening is he is actually cursing Yahweh in the middle of a fight. Like he's calling down curses on Yahweh. That is strictly out of line, totally inappropriate. But it's not the same thing as bearing God's name in vain. It is certainly one incident of that. So I would look at blaspheming the name as like the smaller circle, like in a Venn diagram. If you've seen where there's like concentric circles. So bearing the name is the bigger circle, blaspheming the name is a small circle within that. So when I tell you that the name command is not prohibiting swearing, I'm not saying go ahead and use God's name however you want. It doesn't matter. That's not what it's about. It does matter how we talk about God, but how we talk about God is only one aspect of how we represent him. So it's much broader than that.
I love that. Now I want to go back to the law and the receiving of the law. The giving of the law is a big discussion right now. It always been a big discussion, even before I was born, way before I was born, actually. So why do we look at the law as something that's just a huge burden? Like, man, I'm so glad that I'm not an Israelite, or I wasn't in Israel back then, because keeping these laws, I can't do it.
Yep. It's interesting. I was thinking about that question in light of how the world is responding to the coronavirus pandemic and the new restrictions that we've been given. So to use a controversial example, there are some people who insist on wearing masks and other people who insist on not wearing masks. And it's interesting because I don't know of anybody who like makes a big deal about wearing a seatbelt or driving on the right side of the road. Right. We have all kinds of laws that we obey all the time. The problem with masks is that it's a new one that we would have to get used to. So I think when we come to the Old Testament, it feels really restrictive because we haven't lived in a society that operates by those laws, and they don't all seem intuitive to us. Some of them seem really odd. And so I don't know about you, but I'm the kind of person who does not like obeying a law that I don't understand.
Me too.
If it doesn't make sense to me, then I have a hard time with it. Like if it seems counterintuitive. And as we read the Old Testament law, we are having a cross-cultural experience. This is ancient culture. It's another time and place, another language. They have another system of thought that doesn't jive with ours. So we could easily be like, wow, that seems really restrictive. But I think we can take our clue from Moses' words in Deuteronomy. Is it Deuteronomy 4?
Wow, that passage right there actually changed my whole outlook on the law.
Yeah. So Deuteronomy chapter 4 tells us Moses is talking to his people about the law that was given to them at Sinai. And you and I are thinking, oh, what a drag. But listen to how Moses describes it. He says, see, I have taught you decrees and laws as Yahweh my God commanded me, so that you may follow them in the land you are entering to take possession of. Observe them carefully, for this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nations, who will hear about all these decrees and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. What other nation is so great as to have their gods near them, the way Yahweh our God is near us whenever we pray to him? And what other nation is so great as to have such righteous decrees and laws as this body of laws I'm setting before you today? So Moses is not thinking that the other nations are looking on and saying, phew, I'm glad I'm not an Israelite. Have you heard what they have to do? No, they're standing back and saying, wow, those people have got it made. They have a God who talks to them and tells them what he expects of them. They're not having to guess the way we are, how to make the gods happy and how not to piss them off. I mean, it is serious business in the ancient world not to anger the gods, because when the gods are angry at you, your kids are dying, your crops are failing, you're having, terrible disasters happen until you can figure out what did you do wrong. And it's always guesswork. And the Israelites, in contrast to that, have a God who's come and said, call me by name, and here's what I expect. And the kinds of things he's asking them to do are not radical in that environment. In fact, a lot of it is quite obvious. Don't kill people. Don't kill your neighbor. Don't take your neighbor's wife. you know, there are so many laws that you think, well, yeah, that wouldn't have been rocket science at Sinai. That would have been the prerequisite to having a just society. And so Moses imagines that the other nations will be jealous of this law.
Well, yeah, that's a beautiful way to look at the law. And when I read Deuteronomy 4, it changed my outlook on the law. Because I was somebody who was studying the New Testament before I got into the Old, and I was so confused.
Sure.
I was confused when Jesus was talking about he didn't come to abolish the law. I'm like, what law? I was confused.
Why not?
Right. I was like,
yeah.
What
Let's
you
get rid
about?
of that while we have the chance. And Jesus is like, no, this is good. I'm going to fulfill it.
Right. Can we stay right there then? Because that's a huge argument too. That, okay, Jesus said, I didn't come to abolish the law, but fulfill the law. So we like, okay, Jesus died and rose. He fulfilled everything. So we done away with the law. Just throw the law out the window.
Yeah, lots of people think we don't have to think about it anymore because it's all taken care of at the cross. But if you read the New Testament carefully, you find Jesus teaching his disciples to be good, covenantally faithful people. Like he doesn't actually reduce any restrictions on what they're allowed to do. He actually continues to uphold the law. Paul, who often is thought to have this adversarial relationship with the law, he spends like half of every one of his letters telling them how to live rightly. He's not saying, go do whatever you want. Jesus took care of it. He's not. He's saying, here's how to love each other well. So Jesus, as he looks back at the law, he summarizes it with just two commands: love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. And if we are loving God and loving our neighbor well, we are keeping the law. That's a way of including in one fell swoop all of the commands. Because if I'm murdering my neighbor, I'm not loving them well.
True. You're not loving them at all. You're doing something like that. Not at all.
Right.
It's so much in the law, and I think when people talk about the law, they don't talk about they like, okay, I'm not talking about the 10 Commandments. I'm talking about what's in Leviticus. I'm talking about those laws. Like, I don't want to eat bacon. I want to eat shrimp. And
sure.
I want to do this and do that. And so is it okay for somebody to, follow the law if they want to?
That's a great question. There are two major schools of thought on this, two major approaches. There are those who say the food laws have been done away with in Christ. And so not during Christ's earthly life, but after his resurrection, as the early church was beginning to take the gospel to Gentiles, and they were asking the question, do Gentiles have to become Jews to follow Jesus, or can they follow Jesus as Gentiles? And the early church met to duke it out. And we read about that in Acts 15. And they came to the conclusion that the Gentiles did not have to be circumcised and therefore did not have to follow the food laws. So I would say most scholars today would say that's been set aside, the food laws. But there are Christians today who say, I just had a letter from one just a couple days ago who read and loved my book, but disagreed with me on this issue. He said, I think that what happened in Acts 15 was a way of getting Gentiles in the door, saying everyone's welcome, you can follow Jesus. But then he imagines that they would gradually disciple those people to follow the full Torah, including the food laws. Now, the reason I disagree with him is because I see the food laws as a kind of ethnic badge that they wore. Like, these laws were meant to separate the Israelites as an ethnic group from the other nations while they were learning to follow God. And so when in Acts 15, when the decision is made that Gentiles could join in the church, if Jews are continuing to follow the food laws, they're not going to be able to have table fellowship with Gentile believers. They're going to be separated. You're going to end up having to have two different churches, a Gentile church and a Jewish church. And I see the apostles in the New Testament trying to bring the two together. So I'm not trying to tell a Jewish follower of Jesus, hey, you have to eat bacon. But I'm saying to everybody else, go ahead and eat bacon. And I would say to the Jewish follower of Jesus, that better not stand in the way of your fellowship with other believers, because the doors have been thrown open to Gentiles as Gentiles. So that's my take on it. Yeah, you feel free to push back if you have more questions.
Well, but I think I'm in the same range as you, same area as you. I feel like, okay, if you want to eat bacon, you can eat it. But if you don't want to eat bacon, if you look in the law and it convicts you and you don't want to eat bacon, then fine, don't eat bacon. That's how I am. So, and I think through research, science, blah, 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 you see that bacon is full of bacteria and all that. So somebody.
Yeah, if you have health reasons to avoid it, or if you have missional reasons to avoid it, let's say God has called you to bring the news of Jesus as Messiah to the Jewish people, then I would avoid. I would eat kosher if my primary ministry was to Jewish people. For a time, my husband and I lived and worked in the Philippines as missionaries. We were there to reach out to Muslims. So we did not have any pork. We didn't have any pork in our house. We bought brand new dishes when we moved there, and we never had pork so that we could tell our Muslim friends, there's never been pork in our house or on these dishes. And that actually allowed them to come and have table fellowship with us, which would not have been possible if we'd been eating bacon. So I think there are reasons to avoid pork, missional reasons at times, or perhaps health reasons, but I don't see a theological reason that we need to.
All right, so you don't see it as it's not a salvation issue, because some people make it a salvation issue. Since you're eating bacon, you're not going to be saved.
No, I don't think so at all. I mean, Peter sees this vision of a sheet of animals lowered from heaven, and it's full of unclean animals like pigs that they were not allowed to eat. And the voice says to him 3 times, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." So I take that at face value, that even though there was a larger message there about the gospel going to Gentiles, I think Peter was being told, by keeping the kosher food laws, you are actually preventing the spread of the gospel. And you've got to cut it out. We're in a new era. The time for separation between Jew and Gentile is over. Let's throw open the doors and invite everybody in.
Wow, amazing. So that goes back to me, like, it's the spirit of the law, like just doing the spirit of the law. And I feel like the law still has some practical things in there, like not mingling seeds together so you won't grow these crazy vegetables. And so what is the importance behind it doing just the spiritual part of the law?
Yeah, so I would say when I look at the Old Testament laws, I'm asking myself, why was this law given? And if I can kind of determine the principle behind a law, that can help me think through its relevance for today. So that's going to be different for different sort of categories of law. The Israelites would not have separated between the kinds of laws and seen them as different categories. But looking back from this side of the cross, we see some laws had to do with ritual purity, and they needed to be ritually pure so that they could go to the temple and give sacrifices or perform other rituals. Like, you can't go to the temple to worship God if you're ritually impure. I see the whole ritual purity system as set aside in the New Testament. So I don't think any of those laws have direct relevance to us. But other laws that have to do with, say, agriculture or what you wear or sexual relationships, I think we need to take those seriously and ask, what is this communicating in that cultural context? And how can I communicate the same thing in my cultural context? So you're not going to find any laws about the internet in Leviticus, because there wasn't an internet, but there are laws about not taking what belongs to someone else, not defrauding other people. And I think we can apply those principles to the internet age. One example that I've used with my students is the laws about gleaning. They were not supposed to glean harvest to the edge. Sorry, they were not supposed to harvest to the edges of their field. They were supposed to leave it so that widows and orphans, fatherless, could come and pick up the grain that was left over along the edges. And so if we tried to if we tried to implement that today in the exact same way, we would have some problems. I told you Prairie's surrounded by wheat fields. So we got a lot of farmers in our community. But if they did not harvest their entire crop, it would rot. People are not going to come into their field and start picking up grain and eating it, because that's like trespassing. It's illegal. So we would have to think of other ways to take the spirit of the law, the principle behind that law, which is be generous towards those on the fringes of your community who are in need. People who don't own land, people who don't have the means to come up with these resources for themselves. Be generous with what I've blessed you with. So, and in the case of gleaning, it's not just giving away grain, it's providing jobs. It's providing a day's labor for those people who are on the fringes of society who might not have work otherwise. So no matter what your business is, whether you're a farmer or whether you own the dollar store in town or a McDonald's chain, like, you've got to think about, how can I be generous with what God's given me? How can I provide jobs that will help look after people who are vulnerable?
Right. So it seems like the importance is, don't try to recreate ancient Israel in America, because sometimes we can try to do that.
Right. There are people who seem to think those were the golden days back there in ancient Israel. We should try to emulate that way of life as much as we can. I don't think that's realistic, and I don't think that's what God is asking us to do. He came and revealed himself to the Israelites in ways that made sense in ancient Israel. He accommodated himself to their cultural context. And I think he's inviting us to live out our faith in ways that are relevant in our cultural context. So we need to think through, what does it look like to bear God's name with honor on social media? What is that going to mean about the way we speak and the way we interact? Or what is it going to look like to honor God with the electoral system that we have, the way we do voting in our countries? How can we be faithful followers of God in this context? I don't think we need to do away with our democracy and reinstate a theocracy. I don't think that's possible or even ideal. I think God is asking us to live faithfully as covenant members in the context we have. And that requires us to really be creative.
Right. And that does require us to be creative, really think about what we're doing, how to apply this law to our lives, and really be fruitful and be faithful to God. And so it goes back to Paul, because Paul writes about the law so much. What's a misunderstanding that we have about Paul? Because sometimes I feel like Paul say, okay, the law brings wrath, and then the law is good. And some people are confused about this. So I want to get your...
There's a lot of confusion about Paul and the law. Part of it is because I think we assume that when Paul's talking about the law in dismissive ways, that he's dismissing the law itself, when in fact, I think Paul is dismissing misinterpretations of the law. He's looking at the ways it's been misused or misunderstood, and he's trying to do away with that. And we throw the baby out with the bathwater. Paul was a law-abiding Jew, and he tells people to live faithfully and to walk well with God. So I think we assume Paul is trying to get rid of something. He's not. He's trying to reform it. We also assume that Paul disagrees with Moses, that if we got Paul and Moses in a room, they would have to duke it out. When in fact, I actually think they agree. And our problem is that we misunderstand Moses. So I think we think, and you alluded to this in the email conversation we had, we think that the law was the means of salvation for ancient Israelites, that they obeyed the law so that they would be saved. And of course, Paul would have to get rid of that idea because we're saved through faith in Jesus. But if we go back and read the law carefully, in its context, we find, the people were already saved before they get the law. The law is not a means of salvation. The law is God inviting them to a life of freedom in relationship with him. This is what life is supposed to look like after you're saved, not how to get saved. So I think I think we misunderstand Paul and we misunderstand Moses, and then we think they're saying something other than each other, when in fact they go really well together.
Oh, yes, that is absolutely true. That's how I'm looking at the law now. I don't think Moses and Paul will get into the room. Okay, what's up, bro? We got to fight now because you disagree with me. I disagree with you. I don't believe that. I believe that's why Paul said the law is righteous, holy, and good.
Exactly.
And like you said, I guess he was just, during his time, he was trying to let people know who are misinterpreting the law and just use it as abuse. Like we see it in our times now, like pastoral abuse that's going on in churches and stuff like that.
Yeah, Paul is not speaking into a vacuum. He's not like designing the ultimate doctrinal treatise that says the final word on everything. He is speaking into a context in which people have disagreements, ideas, practices that are wrong, that he is trying to correct and overcome. And we're listening in. We kind of like walked into the room in the middle of a conversation when we're reading Paul's letters. So we shouldn't assume that he's trying to make a blanket statement about the absolute value of the law when he's actually talking to people who have misunderstandings of the law and correcting those. And that requires a lot of work. It requires us to dig into what's going on in Judaism in the first century, what's going on in the early church, what are their ideas, their false ideas that he's trying to address.
Wow. So, man, I need to get a poster and put that on a wall, that the Israelites were saved before the law. They were set free before the law, man. That is so amazing to me. We look at the Passover. That required faith. Like you have to have faith to do that. I guess faith has always been in works. And then the law just came along. Man, that is just an amazing way to look at the law. And I feel like if we start looking at the law like that, we will appreciate the Old Testament more.
We would,
and get a better understanding of the New Testament. But before we wrap this up, I know you got to go. But before we wrap this up, I really want to know this about Jesus living out Israel in his life. Please just elaborate on that. You don't have to elaborate, but please just let us know.
Yeah, so this is such a fun thing to explore. And this is part of the reason why Sinai still matters, because if you try to read the New Testament without knowing the Old Testament, you totally miss so much cool stuff that tells us who Jesus is. If we really want to know Jesus, we've got to know the story that he's mimicking and imitating with his life. So the New Testament gives us all kinds of clues that connect Jesus in with Israel's story. So as one example, in the book of Matthew, the birth narratives, these early moments of Jesus' life and birth, they're told in ways that mimic Israel's story. So I told you a little while ago that what happened to Moses then happened to the whole nation. And here we have it going in reverse. What happens to Jesus as a baby is reminding us of what happened to the whole nation, like looking back. So Herod is trying to kill all the baby boys. Oh, this has happened before. I know about a king that tried to kill all the baby Hebrew boys. So he's trying to kill all the baby boys. Jesus' life is threatened. And so his parents whisk him away. Where do they bring him? To Egypt. They bring him to Egypt to escape Herod, who was acting an awful lot like Pharaoh from ancient Egypt. And there he's safe until Herod dies, and his family is able to return to the land, which is exactly what happens with Moses. Moses runs from Pharaoh, and then the angel of the Lord tells him, those seeking to kill you are dead. So go back to Egypt and bring out my people. So he waits until Pharaoh dies, and then he goes back to Egypt. So we've got this reversal of the promised land and Egypt in those two stories, but it's really clear that the one is mimicking the other. So that's a fun one to explore. But then I think what's really mind-blowing is the temptation story. When Jesus goes out in the wilderness and he's tempted by Satan, 3 times he responds to Satan's temptations by quoting scripture. And all 3 times he quotes from the book of Deuteronomy. And he quotes from the section of Deuteronomy that describes Israel's wandering in the wilderness. and the places where they failed to be faithful to God in the wilderness. So Jesus is now in the wilderness, wandering around. He wanders for 40 days. Israel wandered for 40 years. And he's being tempted in the same ways that Israel was tempted, and yet he is passing the test. He is remaining faithful to Yahweh and doing the right thing. He's refusing to worship other gods. He's refusing to take a shortcut and seize power for himself. And by passing the test that Israel failed, he is showing us to be the true righteous remnant, that we can follow him and put our faith in him because he's the true Israelite. It's just mind-blowing stuff.
Wow. Beautiful. That's how you connect the Bible, folks. I mean, that's how you connect the Bible. This is just one great, beautiful story. And when we throw the Old Testament away, we miss all of this. We just sit there and be like, okay, yeah, Jesus was tempted by the devil. He was in the wilderness. He was there for 40 days. Like you mentioned, Moses was on the mountain for 40 days, 40 nights. Jesus was tempted 40 days, 40 nights. So it's just a connection. If we never had that Old Testament, we wouldn't know this at all. So we do not need to throw away the Old Testament, folks. We don't need to. Even though you might not understand something in the Old Testament, I feel like a lot of people don't understand things in the New Testament too. Some stuff
it's true.
We just not going to understand. We just not going to understand. And I learned to live with that, and I'm fine with that. But I just want to get your last thoughts on this. You can make it quick if you want to. How can we live out this commandment to bear God's name correctly?
I think what we need to recognize is that our faith in God is not personal and private. It's public and conspicuous. The world is watching us. When we claim to follow Jesus, the world is watching us, and they're watching us to find out what sort of God he is and what this is all about. And so I think to bear his name well, we need to be thinking about how our whole lives are on display for the world. We need to do everything we do as though it's a part of our mission to represent him. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Dr. Imes. We have the people still in studio. You know, they still screaming.
They're going wild.
It's all right. We going by the guidelines a little bit.
They've got masks on.
Yeah, they got masks on, even though they sound a little loud, but they still got masks. But people, I'm telling you, go get this book, Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters. You will read your Bible in a different fashion. And that's what we need. We need people to look at the Old Testament in a beautiful way so we can look at the New Testament in a beautiful way. And so this book changed the way I looked at the Old Testament and the New Testament, brought all these great revelations, and I'm sure you heard it on the show. So, Dr. Imes, can you just let the people know how they can get in contact with you?
Sure. You can find me on Facebook. Follow me there. I'm on Twitter, Carmen Joy Imes. I have a blog, carmenjoyimes.blogspot.com. And you can find me on YouTube. My channel's called Carmen Joy Imes. There's a common theme to all those. Just look for Carmen Joy Imes. So you can subscribe to my YouTube channel and watch the Torah Tuesday videos. Those are fun. I always love hearing from readers and hearing what they thought of the book. So feel free to reach out.
All right. I don't know what that was, but that's not the people in here. But anyway, Daily Thinkers, man, I thank y'all for tuning into this episode. Again, let me say this again for the third time, and I'm going to say it 100 times more. Make sure you go get this book, Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters, because Sinai still matters, folks. So anyway, Daily Thinkers, we are out. Just keep on thinking, keep questioning, keep asking, but most of all, please keep trusting Christ Jesus. Thank you, Dr. Imes, for coming on the show. We love to have you here at the Daily Thinker again, and we thank you for most of all writing this great book. Thank you.
All right. Thanks
being
for
faithful
having
to
me.
the Lord.